Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm going to talk to you today about how the U.S. did not cause the Korean War. Okay? The United States, in 1945, they did the best they could do. Okay? The Soviets came through Korea, and they did not meet much resistance from any Japanese military. And the United States had to promise the Soviets the Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands just to even fight Japan. The Soviets wanted to maintain neutrality and be neutral in the Pacific theater. And they only fought Japan for 3 months and 3 days. The United States fought Japan for almost 4 years. But the Soviets were the first anti-Japanese forces that the Koreans saw. And because Japan had occupied Korea and controlled Korea very tightly, Korea was isolated largely from the outside world. And many Koreans at the time were not sure what communism was. Yes, they did welcome the Soviets as liberators, but the Americans got there and they told the Soviets to stop at the 38th parallel. They drew the 38th parallel line, and the Americans said, we're taking control of South Korea. Now, the Americans did not have a strong enough army at the time and enough resources to stop a Soviet invasion. And they knew the Soviets were not going to give them the whole peninsula, the whole Korean peninsula. Let me explain this. Around that time, the U.S. military budget, because World War II had ended, the U.S. military budget went from $82 billion down to $13 billion. And the U.S. Army was the main force in South Korea. The U.S. Army only got $4 billion of that budget. So, the Americans knew the Soviets weren't going to give them the whole peninsula. And America did not have a force at that time big enough or strong enough to withstand a Soviet invasion. Okay? Things are different now, but back then they did not. And so the U.S. occupied South Korea, the Soviets occupied North Korea. Technically, the Soviets occupied North Korea from 1945 to 1948. I say it was from 1945 to 1950. And around that time, Kim Il-sung, despite Soviet soldiers raping many Korean women, despite the Soviet soldiers pillaging a lot of villages, that Kim Il-sung still praised the Soviet military. And it was so bad that a North Korean tried to assassinate Kim Il-sung. But a Soviet officer was standing between the assassin and Kim Il-sung. So then also, had the U.S. not told the Soviets to stop and drew the line, all of Korea would be under Kim Jong-un's control right now. Okay? Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, the Soviets were going to appoint him. Kim Il-sung trained at the Kharbarovsk Infantry Officer School in the Soviet Union. He became a captain in the Soviet Army. When he got to become ruler of North Korea, his Russian and Chinese language skills were better than his Korean language skills. It just doesn't compute that some people may think, no, that wouldn't have happened. Yes, it would have, because the Soviets were determined to see Kim Il-sung as their ruler, and if the Soviets got control of the entire peninsula, that's what they were going to do. Regardless of a lot of North Koreans before Kim Il-sung took power, they wanted Cho Man-sik to be the ruler of North Korea, or the leader. But the Soviets wanted Kim Il-sung. Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung's son, was born in the Soviet Union. I mean, this is what happened. And then, okay, now, the first president of South Korea, Sung Man-rhee, I was not a fan of him, but he was not pro-Japanese. He went into exile in the United States during World War II. He earned a PhD from Princeton University, and he come back to become leader of South Korea. Now, I will consent there were South Korean government and military officials that collaborated with the Japanese government. But when America drew that line, they had to draw that line very quickly. They had to get to South Korea very quickly. America did not have a long-term policy for Korea drawn out, and they couldn't get one drawn out immediately. So having those officials with government experience in there was just done for one word, and Victor Cha notes this. Victor Cha is a Korean-American scholar. He's wrote many books on North Korea. This was just done for expediency. The U.S. really did not have any other choice than to do what they did in that situation. The U.S. did not have any other choice, and the United States had to get a South Korean government running as quick as possible. Okay. The reason I say the Soviets still controlled Kim Il-sung is because Kim Il-sung had to petition Joseph Stalin to invade South Korea. And granted, it was a petition Joseph Stalin granted to him. They had to petition him a long time, but Joseph Stalin granted him the request. So, no, America did not cause the Korean War. Okay? And you could argue if this was the right policy or not, but America really made sure that there were not a lot of clashes along the 38th parallel. They were trying to keep the Korean War from happening. Now, you could argue if that was the correct policy or not, but again, like I said, between 1945 and 1950, had the South Koreans invaded North Korea, the Soviets would have retaliated, and America between 1945 and 1950 just did not have a lot of the resources or the manpower to withstand a Soviet invasion. Now, I said between 1945 and 1950. Now, when Kim Il-sung petitioned Joseph Stalin to invade in 1950, it changed. And while the Korean War was going on, defense budgets increased. So during the Cold War, South Korea as well as the U.S. would be able to withstand a Soviet invasion. After the Korean War, they would have been able to, but not between 1945 and 1950. Defense budgets were steadily declining until around 1950 because America had just won World War II, and plus a lot of it, and they just won World War II. So, America did the best they could in that situation, and they kept South Korea from being under communist control. They did all they could do, and they also did most of the fighting against Japan in the Pacific Theater of World War II. The Soviets only had one major engagement with the Japanese, and that was out in Manchuria, and it was technically listed as a major engagement, but it was a minor engagement compared to what the U.S. did at Iwo Jima, what they did at Guam, what they did at Saipan, what they did in the Philippines. All that island hopping eventually led to the defeat of Japan. Also what the U.S. did in Okinawa. So no, America did not cause the Korean War. North Korea caused the Korean War, and Kim Il-sung petitioned Joseph Stalin to invade South Korea. Plain and simple. And you could argue that the Soviets caused the Korean War because the Soviets granted Kim Il-sung, the Soviets granted Kim Il-sung that petition. America had nothing to do with starting the Korean War. America did the best they could in that situation. Quite frankly, they did. And then you talk about the American occupation of South Korea. Yes, they outlawed the Communist Party. Yes, they outlawed pro-North Korean parties. But here's why they did that. Koreans did not have complete knowledge at that time of what communism really was. Americans did. And Koreans eventually learned very quickly because when North Korea invaded South Korea and they took over Seoul, originally the population of South Korea was very welcoming because they thought communism was an ideology of distributing free food and free medical care and many of those things. But the people of Seoul found out quickly that that was not the case because during the first North Korean occupation of Seoul during the Korean War, North Korea occupied Seoul, and they massacred 25,000 people in less than 3 months. And British historian Max Hastings notes that, and in his book, Korean citizens who were in Seoul at the time said their attitudes changed from pro-communist to anti-communist like that very quickly. So the U.S. had to keep part of Korea from being controlled by communism. They would have liked the whole peninsula, but they had enough. There was a lot of logic in there. They knew that the Soviets were not going to grant them the whole Korean peninsula. And the U.S. had nothing economically to gain by gaining control of South Korea the way they did because when Japan controlled Korea, they treated South Korea's economy like a breadbasket. All the economic development was in North Korea. The U.S. was just trying to keep communism from taking over South Korea as well. And that's what would have happened had the U.S. not stopped the Soviets when they did and where they did. So, anyway, hope everybody's doing well. Take care. God bless and bye-bye. Bye-bye.